The heat came off the asphalt in waves thick enough to taste. Drywell, Arizona, a town of 900 people, one working traffic light, two gas stations that sold the same bad coffee at different prices, and a diner called Cassidy's that had been feeding truckers and lost tourists since before most of the men in the parking lot were born. The sign out front had lost two letters sometime in the previous decade, and nobody had gotten around to fixing them. The town didn't mind. Towns like Drywell had stopped minding about a lot of things a long time ago. The annual memorial ride had been running for 14 years. Every July, brothers from chapters across 4 states rolled into Drywell to remember the ones who didn't make it home. Crashes, cancer, wars that followed men back from the desert and finished the job quietly in bedrooms and parking lots, and VA waiting rooms that smelled like industrial cleaner and resignation. The club kept a leather-bound ledger in a locked case bolted to the road captain's saddlebag, and every name in that book had been read aloud at least once under open sky. While engines idled and grown men said nothing because nothing was the only honest thing left to say. Cole Rader sat on the edge of a concrete parking barrier with his boots in the dirt and a cup of black coffee going cold in his hand. 53 years old, road captain for the past 9, 2 tours in Fallujah before that, back when the war was still something people argued about at dinner tables, instead of something they'd agreed to forget. He had a scar that ran from his left ear down beneath his collar, a titanium plate holding his jaw together on the left side, and a way of watching people that made most of them look away first. He didn't talk much, hadn't in years. The men who rode with him understood that silence was its own language, and Cole spoke it fluently in the particular dialect of a man who had learned that most of what people said out loud was just noise covering the thing they actually meant. The parking lot churned around him with the controlled chaos of a gathering that had been doing this long enough to have its own rhythms. Brothers shaking hands, slapping backs, trading road stories across state lines. Chrome catching the morning sun and throwing it back in blinding arcs. The smell of exhaust and hot leather in the particular dust of a high desert town that had been drying out since before anyone alive could remember. 191 motorcycles, Harleys mostly, a few Indians, a couple of older Triumphs that belonged to men who'd rather wrench on something with history than admit the world had moved on without them. Grant Hollis, the chapter president from Flagstaff, stood near the diner's front door, arguing with the owner about table arrangements. Grant was 6'4", 260 pounds, with a voice like a diesel engine at idle, and a patience for logistics that contradicted everything about the way he looked. He'd been running the Flagstaff chapter for 11 years. He'd buried more brothers than Cole could count on both hands. Cole watched. He always watched. It wasn't a habit he'd developed. It was something closer to a condition. 2 tours had rewired something in the part of his brain that processed the world, and the rewiring had never fully resolved itself back into anything resembling normal civilian perception. He noticed exits. He noticed hands. He noticed when the geometry of a situation didn't add up, the way a carpenter notices when a wall isn't quite plumb even before he puts a level to it. The heat pressed down. A hawk circled above the fuel station across the road riding thermals, with the patience of something that had never needed to hurry because it had never had anywhere to be. Cole watched it for a moment and almost felt something like envy for the simplicity of that. He almost missed her. She came around the corner of the fuel station's cinder block wall like something the desert had been holding in reserve. Small, thin, brown hair matted against her skull in the particular way that happens when hair goes unwashed for days in dry heat. No shoes. A t-shirt that had been white once, now the color of the road she'd been walking. And over everything hanging past her knees like a coat taken from a man 3 times her size, a black leather jacket that had seen years of road and weather and the kind of use that leaves its own particular record in the creasing of the leather. She stopped at the edge of the parking lot. She didn't cry, she didn't run, she didn't call out or wave or do any of the things a lost child does when she finally finds people. She stood there with her arms straight down at her sides, the jacket sleeves covering her hands entirely, and she watched the motorcycles the way a person watches something they've been told about for a long time, and are now seeing for the first time and trying to reconcile the reality with the description. Cole set his coffee down. He didn't stand immediately. He didn't move fast or call out or do anything that would change the atmosphere of the moment before he understood it. He shifted his weight forward and looked at her. And something in his chest did the thing it sometimes did, the thing that had no name, but that he'd learned to trust over 2 decades, the feeling of a situation that didn't add up. A kid, alone, middle of nowhere. July heat that was already pushing past 100 degrees before noon. No shoes. 3 days of road on her at minimum, maybe more from the look of her skin and the way she stood with the careful stillness of someone whose feet hurt badly enough that moving them unnecessarily had stopped being an option she considered. And the jacket. He looked at the jacket. The patches were visible even from where he sat. The center rocker, the chapter designation, and on the chest below the main patch, a name tab stitched in white thread on black. Cole stood up, his knees complained, his back registered its opinion. He crossed the parking lot with his hands visible and his steps deliberate, and the conversations around him died one by one as other men noticed what he was walking toward, the way conversations always die when someone starts moving with that particular quality of purpose. The girl didn't run. She tilted her head slightly and watched him come with eyes that were brown and steady and far too old for the face they were sitting in. Not frightened, not relieved. Something past both of those things. The flat, still surface of a child who had already learned through whatever process had produced this moment that being afraid didn't change anything, and that showing relief before you understood the situation was a form of carelessness you couldn't afford. Cole stopped 10 feet away. He knelt down on one knee. The asphalt burned through his jeans immediately. "Hey," he said. She looked at him. "You okay?" She didn't answer that. Her eyes moved past him, briefly scanning the rows of motorcycles, the men, the leather and patches, reading the lot the way someone reads a page when they're looking for a specific word and need to find it before they commit to anything. "My name's Cole. Those are my friends back there. Nobody's going to hurt you." Her eyes came back to him. She looked at his face for a moment with the careful attention of someone taking inventory. Then she looked down at the jacket she was wearing. She lifted one hand, the sleeve falling back to reveal fingers that were chapped and dirty, and touched one of the patches on the chest with her fingertips. A slow touch, the kind you use on something that belongs to someone you love and can't find. "My dad wore this jacket," she said. Her voice was small and dry and matter-of-fact, and it carried across the parking lot in the silence the way a stone carries across still water. Outward and outward until it reached the men who had stopped pretending not to watch, and were now simply watching openly with the particular stillness of people who have just heard something that doesn't fit the shape of the world they thought they were standing in. Cole looked at the patch. His hand stopped moving. The name tab was stitched in white thread on black backing the same way the club had been doing it for 30 years. Small letters, clean edges, the kind of stitching that takes time and care, and the knowledge that the thing you're making is meant to last. Nate Briggs. Cole's throat closed. Nate Briggs had been dead for 6 years. He had drowned in the Verde River during a solo ride in November, a November that Cole still thought about sometimes, in the specific way you think about months that cost you something permanent. Nate's bike had been pulled from the water 3 days after he went missing. His body had never surfaced. The sheriff's office had ruled it an accident, closed the case in under 2 weeks, and the Steel Saints had added his name to the ledger and read it aloud every July in this exact parking lot. Cole had read it himself 3 times. He'd stood in this heat and said Nate's name into the open air and felt the weight of it and moved forward because that was what you did. You carried the dead. You didn't question them. You read their names and you kept riding, and you told yourself that was enough. The girl was wearing Nate's jacket, and she was alive, and she was standing in front of Cole with desert dirt on her face and a calm that belonged to someone 3 times her age, and she was waiting for him to understand something he wasn't ready to understand yet. "What's your name?" Cole asked. His voice came out wrong, too rough, too low. "Ren." Wren what? Wren Briggs. Behind Cole, he heard Grant's boots on the asphalt. Heavy, deliberate, the walk of a big man who had learned a long time ago that moving slowly gave him more information than moving fast. Cole heard him stop, heard the specific quality of his silence, which was not the silence of a man with nothing to say, but the silence of a man who had just seen something that had taken all his words away at once. Nate didn't have a daughter. That was what Cole was thinking, not as a certainty, but as the shape of what he knew, the outline of the man he'd ridden with for 7 years before the Verity River took him. A man who'd never mentioned a child, never brought a family to a rally, a man whose personal life had always existed at a particular distance, close enough that you felt you knew him, far enough that you understood some doors stayed shut. He didn't tell you, Cole thought, and then the girl said it out loud. He didn't tell you, Wren said, not defensive, not explaining, just stating a fact. She had apparently already made peace with the fact that her existence had been a secret her father kept from the people he trusted most, for reasons she either understood or had decided not to question. Cole studied the jacket. The leather was worn but maintained. Not the deterioration of something abandoned, but the patina of something cared for. The patches were intact, the threads unraveling nowhere. The zipper pull was a small skull with a particular design, custom work, the kind of detail you only recognized if you'd seen it before. Cole had seen it before. Nate had machined that skull himself in his garage in Prescott, had shown it off at a rally in Sedona years before anyone started wondering where he'd gone. He'd held it up in the firelight and grinned and said it was the only piece of hardware on the bike he'd made with his own hands, and that meant it was the only piece he completely trusted. This was not a replica. This was not a theft. This was Nate's cut, and it had been maintained by someone who understood what it was. Cole looked at the girl's feet. The damage was extensive. The skin across the balls of both feet had blistered, and the blisters had broken and healed and broken again, the way skin does when it's subjected to sustained contact with hot ground over multiple days. The toenails on 3 toes were bruised dark beneath the nail, the particular injury of someone who had been walking downhill for long enough that the repetitive impact accumulated into something you couldn't ignore. 28 miles. That was the distance roughly from the northern slope of the Mingus mountain range to the edge of Drywell if you came down the eastern face and followed the dry creek bed south. Cole had driven that road more times than he could count. He knew every mile of it. He also knew that no adult would send a child that distance on foot in July unless every other option had already been exhausted or destroyed. "Where did you come from?" he asked. Wren pointed north, toward the mountains, toward the purple shapes on the horizon that sat above the heat shimmer like something painted on glass. "How did you get here?" "Walked." "From where?" "The camp." "What camp?" She didn't answer that one. Her jaw tightened and her eyes went to a place slightly past Cole's face, looking at something that wasn't in the parking lot. And he recognized the shutdown. He'd done it himself 100 times in rooms with people who asked questions he wasn't ready to answer. The particular retreat of a person who has decided, consciously or not, that a specific line of inquiry ends here. Cole looked at the jacket again. "Can I look at the collar?" he asked. "Just the collar. I'll leave the rest alone." Wren considered this with the seriousness of someone weighing a significant decision. Then she stepped forward and tilted her chin up, offering him access. Cole lifted the collar and turned it carefully, the way you handle something old and important. The leather was warm from the sun. He ran his thumb along the inner edge and found what he was looking for, or rather found what he hadn't been looking for, what he hadn't had any reason to expect. A section of the lining that had been carefully restitched by hand. The thread was different from the original, slightly thicker, slightly darker, but whoever had done the work had been meticulous about it. If you weren't looking for it, you wouldn't find it. Cole felt something beneath the leather. Paper. Thin. Folded tight. Sealed with what felt like wax. He looked at Wren. "Can I open this?" She nodded once. He pulled his folding knife from his pocket and slit the stitching with the surgical precision of a man who had spent years doing fine mechanical work on machines he trusted his life to. The stitches parted cleanly. He extracted a single sheet of paper folded into a square no bigger than a book of matches. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the kind of aging that comes from heat and time, but the handwriting inside was different. Recent. The ink had the quality of something written within the last year, maybe the last 6 months. Small, precise letters, the hand of a man who wrote carefully because he knew the words would have to carry weight across a distance he couldn't measure. Cole had seen Nate Briggs' handwriting 100 times, on parts orders, on ride logs, on a birthday card that Nate had slipped into Cole's saddlebag the year Cole's marriage ended, a card that said only 2 words on the inside. Still here, no signature, just those 2 words which were the exact right 2 words for that exact moment, and which Cole had carried in his wallet for 6 years, because some things you don't throw away even after you've convinced yourself you've moved on. He read the note. He read it twice. Then he held it at his side and looked at the mountains to the north and stayed very still for a moment, the way a man stays still when something has just shifted beneath him that he hasn't fully mapped yet, when the ground is still moving and he's waiting to understand the new shape of the terrain before he tries to stand up straight in it. Cole, if you're reading this, Ren found you. She's mine. She's real. Everything they told you about me is wrong. Mercer has a compound north of Mingus Mountain. I couldn't get out. I couldn't get word out. The jacket is the only thing I could send. Don't trust Yavapai County. Don't trust the sheriff. Don't come alone. I know you kept looking. I counted on it. He handed the note to Grant without a word. Grant read it. The big man's face didn't move, but his hands tightened on the edges of the paper before he caught himself and smoothed it carefully, the involuntary grip of a man whose body was responding to information his mind was still trying to process. Mercer, Grant said, not a question. Douglas Mercer, Ren said. He runs the camp. What kind of camp? Ren looked at her empty hands, the kind of look that goes inward instead of outward. The kind you can't leave, she said. The silence in the parking lot had a weight now, a physical pressure that Cole could feel settling onto his shoulders and into the space behind his sternum. 191 men who had come to this town to honor the dead were standing in a July parking lot, learning that the dead might still be breathing and that the world they'd been carrying for 6 years had a shape none of them had known. Cole stood up. He pulled water from his saddlebag and handed it to Ren. She took it with both hands and drank without stopping. Let's get her inside, Cole said. Food and shade. Grant was already moving. Within 3 minutes, there was a table cleared inside Cassidy's and a plate of eggs and a glass of water in front of a girl who ate with the focused efficiency of someone for whom food had recently been a variable rather than a constant. She ate everything. She drank 2 glasses of water. Then she sat back inside the jacket and pulled it tighter around herself. Even though the diner had to be pushing 85 degrees with the ceiling fan working at partial capacity above them. Cole sat across from her. He didn't push. He didn't ask more questions yet. He just sat there with his hands folded on the table and waited because waiting was the thing he'd always been better at than people expected. And because he understood that information offered voluntarily was more reliable than information extracted. Ren looked at the table for a moment, then she looked at Cole. My dad said, find the riders on the patch, she said. He said if anything happened to him, find the riders and show them the jacket. He said they'd know what to do. When did he tell you that? Before he went away. How long ago? Before the snow melted, she said. The last snow. Cole did the math. 4 months, maybe 5. Nate Briggs, listed as dead for 6 years, had been alive and talking to his daughter as recently as last winter, giving her instructions, preparing her, teaching her what to do in the event that doing it became necessary. How did you know to come to Drywell? Cole asked. How did you know we'd be here? He drew me a map, Ren said. She touched her stomach, a brief gesture, almost involuntary. It was inside the jacket too, in a different place. Where is it now? I ate it, she said. After I remembered it, he told me to. He said, don't let anyone find it. The diner was quiet around them. Men at nearby tables were pretending to have conversations while listening to everything. The ceiling fan turned its slow revolution above them. The air conditioning wheezed and shuddered and moved the warm air around without meaningfully reducing the temperature. Cole looked at this girl, this small, sunburnt, careful child who had memorized a map and eaten the evidence, and walked 28 miles through July desert heat with no shoes and arrived at a diner in a town that barely existed and found 191 men in a parking lot. And she had done all of it without losing the jacket, without losing the note sewn into the lining, without breaking in any of the ways that children break when the world asks too much of them too early. She was 8 years old. Cole felt something shift in the part of him that had been calcifying since Fallujah, since the divorce, since the night he'd gotten the call about the Verde River and driven there in the dark and stood on the bank with a flashlight pointed at water that told him nothing. "Wren," he said, "one more question for right now." She waited. "Your dad's note said don't trust the sheriff. Did he ever tell you why?" Wren's eyes went to that inward place again. When they came back, they carried the weight of something she'd decided was safe to say. "Because the sheriff knows Mr. Mercer," she said. "The men at the camp, they talk. When the sheriff came to visit, nobody locked the gates." Cole absorbed this. "Okay," he said. "That's enough for now. You're safe here." "Am I?" she said, not challenging, genuinely asking the way someone asks who has learned not to assume. "You are," Cole said, and he meant it with the specific weight of a man who had spent his adult life making promises he intended to keep. He stepped outside. The heat hit him like a wall. Grant was at the edge of the lot arms folded face carved from something that had stopped being patient. Grant looked at him. "Someone in the system is connected to whatever this is," he said. "The note says don't trust the county. That means if word gets out that she's here, a call gets made. Or a call has already been made. So what do you want to do?" Cole looked north. The mountains sat on the horizon like a jagged wound in the pale sky, purple and brown and absolutely still. The heat shimmer turned the base of them to liquid. "I want to confirm it's real before I ask anyone to act on it," Cole said. "Small team. Tonight, recon only." He looked at Grant. "Boone, Sully, Harlan for navigation. Decker in case we need medical. 5 men. The rest stay here with the girl. And if it's real, then we figure out the next step. And if it's not..." Cole looked at the mountains again. He thought about Nate's handwriting. The specific slant of it, the pressure of the pen on paper, the way Nate always made his capital letters slightly larger than necessary, as if giving each word room to breathe. He thought about the birthday card still in his wallet. Still here. "It's real," he said. Grant studied him for a long moment. The big man's chest rose and fell once slow, and then something in his expression shifted. Not agreement exactly. The thing that happens when a person stops arguing with a conclusion they'd already reached before the argument started. "One more thing," Cole said. He nodded toward the diner. "The waitress, Linda Marsh, she's been here how long?" Grant frowned. "Couple years, I think. She's a local." "She brought Wren pie without being asked," Cole said. "Nobody brings a stranger's kid pie in a place like this, unless they're either the kindest person in the county or they're paying attention for a reason." "You're reading into things." "Maybe," Cole said. "Watch her anyway." He walked back inside. The diner had settled into the particular tense stillness of a room full of people pretending to be relaxed. He sat across from Wren again, and she looked at him with those steady brown eyes, and something in the steadiness of them reminded him of the note in his wallet, the way 2 words could hold more weight than 200. "I'm going to go look for your dad," he said. Wren was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's not at the camp anymore." Cole went still. "What do you mean?" "After the last snow, men came at night, put him in a truck. He didn't fight." A pause. Her fingers moved to the jacket, touching the sleeve the way she'd touched the patch outside. A habitual gesture, the kind that develops when an object becomes the closest thing to a person. "He told me to run, so I ran." "Which direction did the truck go?" "North," she said. "Up the mountain, not down." Cole sat with this. North meant deeper into the range, not out. Not toward a highway or a city. North meant there was somewhere else up there that he didn't know about yet. Your dad, Cole said carefully, when he told you to run, did he say anything else? Wren looked at the table, her hand pressed flat against the front of the jacket over her heart, a gesture so natural and habitual that he almost missed the deliberateness of it. He said the jacket would tell the story, she said. He said everything they needed to know was in the jacket. Cole looked at her hand against the leather. He thought about the note, about the precise stitching over the hidden pocket, about a man who had spent years in a situation where every communication had to be concealed, had to be deniable, had to survive contact with people who were looking for exactly that kind of communication. A man who had learned to hide things in plain sight. The note had been hidden inside the collar, but Wren had said the map was in a different place, a different hidden pocket, which meant Nate had constructed the jacket with multiple concealed compartments, which meant the note and the map might not be everything. Cole looked at the jacket more carefully, not at the patches, not at the collar, at the body of it, the places where the leather was slightly stiffer than it should be, the places where the lining didn't quite drape naturally. He thought about what Wren had said. Everything they needed to know was in the jacket. Not the note, not the map, everything. He didn't ask, not yet. He'd learned a long time ago that the right question asked too early got a different answer than the right question asked at the right time. Wren was watching him the way she'd been watching him since the parking lot, with that careful measuring attention, waiting to see what he was going to do with what he had before she decided what else she was willing to give. Okay, Cole said. I need you to stay here tonight, with my friends. There are men outside who will make sure nobody bothers you. Where are you going? North, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded a single deliberate movement, and the way she did it reminded him of Grant accepting a decision he hadn't made but had recognized as correct. The nod of someone who has already run the options and arrived at the same conclusion. The password is copper, Cole said. Wren looked at him. If anyone comes to the door where you're staying and you don't know who they are, you ask for the password. The password is copper. If they don't know it, they're not one of ours. Something changed in Wren's expression. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. As if this was a language she already spoke, a protocol she already understood, and the fact that Cole was speaking it meant something about which category to put him in. My dad used passwords, she said. I know, Cole said, though he hadn't known this because there were a great many things about Nate Briggs he apparently hadn't known. He stood up. Through the diner window across the road, the Hawk was still circling above the fuel station. Still patient. Still riding the same thermal with the same unhurried ease. Cole watched it for a moment and thought about patience and what it cost and what it was worth. Grant appeared at his shoulder. Before you go, Grant said quietly, why did he address the note to you, not to me, not to the club? To you specifically, give me the real answer. Cole had known this question was coming since the moment he'd read the note. He'd been deciding how to answer it the way you decide how to answer a question that has a true answer and a manageable answer, and you have to choose which one serves the moment. He chose the true one. 6 years ago, Cole said, when the river took him, when everyone accepted it. He looked at his hands. I didn't. Not right away. I went back to that river 4 times, walked the banks with a flashlight and a dog I borrowed from a rancher east of Camp Verde. 3 weeks. Every time I went, I was looking for something that would tell me the story didn't add up. Something the water had missed. Grant said nothing. Everybody else had moved on, Cole said. The sheriff closed the case in 2 weeks. The club read his name and carried him. But I kept going back, because something in me couldn't make the geometry of it work. A man like Nate alone on a river in November and nobody ever. He paused. And then I stopped. The weather turned. The river rose. I told myself I'd accepted it, that it was time. He looked out the window at the mountains. He knew, Cole said. Nate knew I hadn't stopped looking, not really. Somehow he found out. And when he needed to send that jacket somewhere, he sent it to the man he trusted to still be looking. Cole paused. I let him down 6 years ago when I stopped. Grant's jaw worked. The big man looked away, then back. You didn't stop, Grant said. His voice was rougher than usual. You're still here. Cole picked up his coffee. It had gone completely cold. He drank it anyway because it was there, and because some things you finish even when they've stopped being what they were. Get eyes on Linda Marsh, he said. Don't let her make any calls you can't account for. And get Wren somewhere without windows when I leave. He walked to the back of the diner and stood at the screen door that opened onto the alley, looking north through the gap in the buildings at the sliver of mountain visible above the rooflines. Purple and brown and silent. 28 miles. A little girl had walked 28 miles in July heat with no shoes and a secret sewn into the lining of her dead father's jacket, and she had not broken and she had not stopped. Cole Rader thought about the note in his wallet. 2 words. Still here. He pushed open the screen door and walked out into the heat. The logging road north of Drywell didn't appear on any map that relied on satellites or cell towers or anything built after 1987. Harlan knew it from paper from a topographic survey he'd carried in his saddlebag for 11 years, the kind of map drawn by men who walked the ground themselves and marked what they found with the particular precision of people who understood that accuracy was the difference between coming home and not. They left at 3 in the morning. 5 bikes idled behind Cassidy's diner in the alley where the kitchen exhaust fans pushed warm air that smelled like old grease into the already warm night. Cole, Boone, Sully, Harlan, Decker. 5 men who had said yes without asking why, which was either the best definition of loyalty Cole had ever encountered or the most dangerous one. And at 3 in the morning, the distinction didn't feel particularly relevant. Grant stood at the back door with his arms folded and his frame filling the doorway the way a load-bearing wall fills a room. 48 hours, Grant said. Might need more. You don't get more. 48 hours and I call state police and I tell them everything. The note, the girl, all of it. Cole pulled his gloves on. The leather was stiff with the desert cold that came after midnight, the temperature dropping 20 degrees from the afternoon peak in a way that always surprised people who'd never spent a summer night in the high desert. State police aren't county, he said. If someone in Yavapai is connected to the state police, go over their head. That's the point, Grant said. 48 hours, Cole. The girl. 2 brothers on her door, 2 on the lot. Nobody in or out without my authorization. Linda Marsh. Grant's eyes changed. She's here, working the early shift. Razor has eyes on her. She made 1 call on a personal phone around midnight. Razor thought it was family. I'm not sure. Watch her, Cole said. Don't spook her. If she runs, that tells us something too. Grant nodded the slow, deliberate nod of a man filing something away in a place he would not forget. Cole swung his leg over the bike. The engine caught and settled into the low, familiar rumble that had been the closest thing to a reliable heartbeat he'd had for the better part of 2 decades. He looked at his 4 men. Boone, 280 pounds of scar tissue and economy of motion, a former Army Ranger who'd done 3 tours and come back to find that the civilian world had continued without him in the way rivers continue around a rock, accommodating the obstacle without acknowledging it. Sully, lean and quiet, 7 years sober, a man who had been a good IT contractor before the drinking took the job, and a better man after the sobriety took the drinking, who kept his 7-year chip in his vest pocket and his laptop in a waterproof case strapped to his rear saddlebag, with the kind of care that suggested he trusted the machine more than he trusted most people. Harlan the navigator, who had spent 8 years doing mountain reconnaissance with the Marines and had lost 2 fingers on his left hand somewhere in a province Cole had never asked about, and navigated tonight's route from memory and paper without mentioning either loss. Decker the youngest, at 31, a paramedic who had joined the club after watching his partner die on a highway shoulder because the dispatcher had sent them to the wrong mile marker, who carried a trauma kit in his left saddlebag and a particular brand of calm that came from having seen enough chaos to understand it had patterns. Every one of them carried damage. Every one of them had learned to carry it without advertising it, the way load-bearing structures carry weight invisibly constantly without acknowledgement. Cole looked north. The mountains were black shapes against a sky that was beginning to gray. At the absolute edges, the first suggestion of a dawn still 2 hours away. The stars were dense and cold above the desert, and the road ahead was empty in both directions. He dropped his visor. They rode. The highway north of Drywell was empty at 3 in the morning, in the way that desert highways are empty not just without traffic, but without the possibility of traffic, as if the road itself had accepted that it would not be needed for several more hours and had made its own arrangements with the dark. Cole held 65 miles an hour and let his mind work the way it worked best, not forcing it toward conclusions, but giving it the material and the motion and letting the connections come on their own. Nate's note had been addressed to Cole specifically. Not to the club, not to the chapter president, not to the organization that Nate had belonged to for 7 years before the Verde River was supposed to have taken him. To Cole, by name, which meant one of two things. Either the trust was personal, specific to Cole, in a way that wasn't transferable to the institution, or the information in the note required someone with a particular kind of experience to act on it effectively, or both. It was usually both. The mountains grew in the headlights, black and enormous, indifferent to the 5 small machines working their way toward them on a road that got thinner and rougher the further north it ran. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees as they climbed, and Cole felt it in his knuckles and the place on his jaw where the titanium plate conducted cold directly into the bone with a fidelity that his own skeleton hadn't managed. Harlan raised his fist at a pullout 12 miles south of the Mingus Ridgeline. Everyone stopped. Engines died. The forest settled into its own sounds, wind and the creak of old trees, and something beneath both of those, something low and mechanical and constant that didn't belong to anything natural. "Generator," Harlan said. His voice was barely above conversational. Sound carried in canyon country in ways that violated intuition. Cole felt the hair on his forearms rise inside his jacket sleeves. A generator this far into the back country, running at 3 in the morning, meant someone was living out here full time. Not camping, not hunting, living and running equipment that required continuous power and doing it at altitude on an old logging road in the mountains above a town that had no reason to know they were there. "How far?" Cole asked. "Half-mile, maybe less. Sound bounces off the canyon walls. Could be closer. We walk from here." They hid the bikes in a stand of scrub oak 40 yards off the road and covered them with dead branches and brush. It wouldn't fool anyone conducting a deliberate search, but it would keep the chrome from catching light if something in the air above them decided to take an interest. They moved on foot. Cole led. Harlan navigated on his left, one step back, reading the terrain with the continuous low-level attention of a man for whom the ground was a text rather than a surface. Boone brought up the rear with a pair of binoculars he'd carried since a previous life, and a silence that made him nearly invisible despite being the largest object in the landscape. Sully and Decker moved between them. Sully watching left, Decker watching right. Both of them managing the transition from road to wilderness with the particular adaptability of men who had spent years operating in conditions they hadn't chosen. The forest thickened as they climbed. Ponderosa pine and juniper and Douglas fir higher up the ground, soft with years of accumulated needles, the air smelling like resin and cold water, and the faint chemical undertone Cole had caught on the way in. Diesel fuel, solvents, the specific olfactory signature of a place that runs on generators and industrial-grade cleaning products, and the kind of institutional maintenance that happens when you're operating at permanent scale in a location designed to be invisible. Harlan stopped at a ridge. He dropped to one knee and pointed down. Cole lay flat on the ground and pressed the binoculars to his eyes. The clearing below had been cut from the forest by machines. Chainsaw and bulldozer worked the stumps still present at the edges where the trees had been taken at ground level rather than uprooted. 8 buildings arranged in a rough square around a central space. Chain link fencing topped with razor wire that caught the generator light and threw it back in small, cold flashes. Two guard towers, improvised structures of lumber and corrugated metal, functional rather than sophisticated, positioned to cover the approaches from the south and west. A generator shed with a fuel tank large enough to run the compound for weeks without resupply. Three trucks parked in a row along the eastern fence, all dark-colored, all with the unmarked practical look of vehicles purchased for use rather than appearance. And set apart from the other buildings, half buried in the hillside at the northern edge of the clearing, a structure that didn't match the others. Lower, partially subterranean. A reinforced door facing south steel with a commercial-grade padlock. No windows. No vents visible from this angle. A single light fixture above the door, battery-powered, casting a pale yellow cone over the entrance. Cole had been in rooms like that. Not in this country. But the design philosophy was recognizable regardless of geography. You built a room like that when you needed to contain something that could not be allowed to make sound that reached the surface. He lowered the binoculars. Men with rifles walked the perimeter. He counted 4 on visible patrol routes, spacing and timing that suggested training, or at least consistent instruction. The way they carried the rifles, slung rather than shouldered, but with a hand always near the grip, indicated familiarity rather than performance. These were not men playing soldier. These were men who had learned how to do this from someone who knew. Cole passed the binoculars to Harlan without speaking. Harlan studied the compound for 90 seconds with the systematic patience of a man cataloging rather than reacting. He passed them back. Cole looked one more time at the half-buried building with the reinforced door. He thought about what Wren had said, the kind you can't leave. He lowered the binoculars and stood slowly, keeping below the ridgeline. The others watched him. "Enough," he said. "We go back." They came back down the ridge the way they'd come up, each footstep deliberate, no unnecessary sound. The generator hum followed them down the slope and then fell behind as the forest thickened and the canyon walls deflected it. By the time they reached the bikes, the sound was gone, and the forest had closed back around them with the complete indifference of old-growth timber to human activity. They rode back in silence. The sun came up while they were still on the highway, and the desert went from black to gray to the particular punishing white of a July morning that doesn't bother with gradation. Cole's body registered the accumulated cold of the night ride as he warmed up the specific ache of middle-aged muscle that has been held at tension in cold air for 3 hours. The titanium plate in his jaw announced itself with the particular persistence it reserved for mornings after cold nights. He noticed the absence before he'd fully pulled back into the diner lot. The space near the kitchen window where Linda Marsh had been parked the previous evening was empty. He filed it without reacting. He killed his engine and walked inside. Grant was at the back table with coffee and a face that said he had not slept and was not inclined to pretend otherwise. "She left at 6, Grant said before Cole could ask. Razor confirmed. Drove east on the county road. Phone's off. I sent Teller to follow as far as the junction. And? Nothing. She's gone." Cole sat down. "The compound is real," he said. Grant leaned forward. Cole described it. The clearing, the fencing, the guard towers, the patrol patterns, the generator shed, in the fuel tank, in the 3 dark trucks. He described the half-buried building with the reinforced door, and no windows, in the padlock, in the light above the entrance, and what kind of room you build when you need to prevent sound from traveling upward. Grant listened without interrupting. The big man's face went through several adjustments during this recitation, none of them in the direction of surprise. They were the adjustments of a man who had been hoping for a different story and was updating his expectations in real time. "How many men?" Grant asked. 4 on visible patrol. Could be 20 inside. Armed. Carrying like they know how. Grant picked up his coffee and set it back down without drinking. "We take this to state police." "And say what?" Cole said. "That we were hiking on private land in the middle of the night and found a compound. They'll want to know how we found it. That means Wren. That means the system gets involved. The moment the system gets involved, someone makes a call." "You don't know that." Nate's note said, "Don't trust the county." A man who's been inside that compound for 6 years wrote those words for a reason. Someone in the county closed his case in 2 weeks and stopped looking. Grant was quiet for a moment. Outside the parking lot was coming to life with the sounds of men who'd been waiting all night for something to do. Cole. Grant's voice had changed, quieter, the register he used when he was saying something he'd been holding back. 6 years ago, when everyone else accepted the river, you went back 4 times, 3 weeks. You just told me that. Grant looked at him directly. Are you sure what you're seeing up there is intelligence, or is it what you need it to be? The question landed. Cole felt it in his sternum, the precise location where old wounds lived when they were healthy enough to remind you they were there. The compound is real, Cole said. The razor wire is real. The guards are real. The building with no windows is real. You can call it whatever you need to call it. I call it a situation. Grant held the look for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way he always nodded when he'd made a decision he was going to have to live with. The parking lot erupted before either of them could say another word. Not in the panicked way that bad news erupts. In the specific way that information moves through a group of men who have been waiting for it. Voices dropping, bodies orienting, the instinct level reordering of attention that happens when the ambient threat level shifts without announcement. Cole walked outside. 3 black trucks sat on the highway, shoulder 200 yards north of the diner. No plates visible from this distance. Engines running. Tinted windows. Commercial-grade Ford F350s, relatively new, the kind of vehicle purchased in quantity by organizations that needed capable, anonymous transport. They weren't moving. They were just sitting there. Cole felt the specific cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Boone, he said. Binoculars. Boone handed them over. Cole studied the trucks. Tinted windshields. No front plates. The driver's position in the lead truck occupied movement visible through the glass when the light caught it right. The other truck still. How many men in an F350? Cole said. Cab seats 5, Boone said. Bed could carry 4 more if they're not worried about comfort. Up to 27, Cole said, against 191 men standing in an open parking lot with no cover and a child in the building behind them. And if those trucks are here because Linda Marsh made a call last night, Sully said, not loudly, just clearly, then they already know the girl is here. They already know what she carried in. Cole handed the binoculars back. He looked at the trucks for 3 more seconds. Then he turned and walked into the diner. Wren was in booth 3. She was sitting where he'd left her jacket zipped despite the heat, a glass of orange juice in front of her that someone had brought. She'd been watching the window. She saw the expression on his face, and her own face didn't change, but something behind her eyes did, a recognition, the acknowledgement of a situation she'd been expecting. Back room, Cole said. There's a walk-in cooler off the kitchen. Wren slid out of the booth. There's a password, Cole said when they reached the cooler door. You remember copper, she said. He opened the door. The cold rolled out over them, 40 degrees of it, the inside smelling like produce and dairy, and the specific clean cold of commercial refrigeration. Stay here, Cole said. Door stays closed. You open it for me or Grant, nobody else, and only after the password. You understand. Wren stepped inside. She turned to face him from within the cold, the jacket hanging to her knees, her breath already making small clouds in the refrigerated air. They're here for the jacket, she said. Cole looked at her. Aren't they? She said. Not a question. We don't know who's in those trucks yet, Cole said. They always come for the jacket, Wren said. Mr. Mercer knew my dad was making it. He just didn't know what was in it. Cole kept his voice level. What's in it, Wren? She held his eyes. In the cold light of the refrigerator bulb, with the frost beginning to form on the shoulders of the leather jacket, she looked very young and very old in equal measure. The combination that only appears in children who have been asked by circumstance to carry weight that belongs to adults. Everything, she said. Cole pulled the door shut. He stood in the kitchen for 3 seconds with his hand still on the door handle, breathing air that smelled like grease and dish soap, feeling the specific weight of a word that had just changed the geometry of the entire situation. Not the note, not the map she'd eaten, not the jacket as a symbol or a plea. Everything. He walked back to the front of the diner. The driver's door of the lead truck just opened, Boone said from Cole's left. A man stepped out. Tall, lean, mid-50s, wearing a khaki shirt tucked into canvas work pants and boots that had seen years of actual outdoor use. His hair was gray and cut short, and his face had the weathered, angular look of someone who'd spent decades outdoors in conditions that hadn't been comfortable. He moved with the easy, measured stride of a man who considered the ground beneath him to be his by default rather than by negotiation. The badge on his belt caught the morning sun. Yavapai County Sheriff's Office. Cole walked to meet him without waiting to be asked. He crossed the lot, crossed the road, shoulder covered the distance between the diner and the trucks, with the deliberate pace of a man who intends to control the location of a conversation before the conversation begins. He stopped at 20 feet. The sheriff stopped at the same distance, both of them in the sun equidistant from whatever was about to happen. That's a lot of motorcycles, the sheriff said. Annual memorial ride, Cole said, 14th year. I know what you do. I'm Sheriff Carl Dunning. I've been getting calls about your gathering since yesterday. We haven't caused any trouble. Nobody said you did. Dunning's smile was the kind that lived entirely in the surface muscles of the face and communicated nothing about the interior. You've got a girl with you. Young girl, 8 or 9, showed up yesterday looking like she'd been living rough. I got a report this morning. An unaccompanied minor is a law enforcement matter. Cole looked at him, not at the badge, at his face, at the way his eyes moved, at the position of his hands, at the micro adjustments in his posture that people made without knowing they were making them when they were managing the distance between what they were saying and what they meant. We were about to contact authorities, Cole said. She was traumatized. She needed food and water first. I appreciate that, but there are procedures. She walked out of the desert alone. We didn't think handing a traumatized child to the first badge that showed up was necessarily the right move. Dunning's expression didn't change. I've got a CPS liaison in the second truck. We'll take the girl, process her through the system, find her family, and everyone goes home clean. She's wearing a jacket, Cole said, from one of our former members. He watched Dunning's face when he said it. There it was, the pupils contracting, a forward lean, barely measurable, the hand that had been resting on his belt moving 2 inches closer to the holstered sidearm before stopping. The involuntary choreography of a man who has just heard a specific piece of information he was waiting to hear and is adjusting the plan accordingly. Which member, Dunning said. His voice was the same, perfectly the same, which was itself a tell. Man named Nate Briggs. Passed away 6 years ago. River accident. Cole paused one beat. Your office handled that case. Dunning looked at him. The surface of his expression was professional and patient. Behind it, something was running calculations at a speed that didn't match the casual posture. I remember the Briggs case, he said. Sad business. Body never recovered. No, Cole said. It wasn't. A silence. I'll need the jacket, Dunning said. It may be evidence in an open case. You just said it was a closed case. Cases can be reopened. Cole looked at the man. The sheriff's hand was 2 inches from his holster, and the morning sun was directly behind Cole's right shoulder, and the 3 trucks on the highway shoulder had not moved. Sully appeared at Cole's right side. He held his phone at an angle that allowed Cole to see the screen without making the gesture obvious to anyone watching from a distance. The search results were already loaded. Sully had been working since they came back from the mountain, pulling everything he could find on the players in this situation, with the methodical efficiency of a man for whom databases were a native language. The relevant section was highlighted. Sheriff Carl Dunning, appointed 4 years ago, preceded by 20 years in county administration. Prior to that, 8 years as property manager for a land trust called High Desert Holdings, which maintained holdings across Yavapai County, including a 60-acre parcel on the east slope of the Mingus Mountain Range, purchased 8 years ago from a dissolved copper mining concern. 8 years ago, 2 years before Nate Briggs supposedly drowned. Cole handed the phone back to Sully without looking at it again. He looked at Dunning. 30 minutes, Cole said. Let me talk to her. Get her calm before you transition her to your people. Dunning considered this with a stillness that was different from patience. I'll be back in 30 minutes, he said. After that, I come back with a warrant and we do this the way the law provides. He turned and walked back to his truck. The door closed. The three vehicles sat on the shoulder with their engines running and their windows sealed, and the dust from their arrival settling slowly back to earth. Cole and Sully walked back to the lot. He manages the land the compound sits on, Cole said quietly. Manage, Sully said. Past tense, but the LLC that owns the parcel still lists him as a registered agent. It's a shell 2 shells deep, but it's traceable if you know what to look for. Which means he's not just covering for Mercer, he's invested. He has a financial stake in whatever operation is running on that mountain. Cole stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the parking lot and thought about the shape of it. Dunning connected to the land, the compound on the land, Nate inside the compound. Nate's note saying, don't trust the county. Nate's case file closed in 2 weeks by the same county whose sheriff had a financial interest in the property where Nate was being held. And now Dunning standing in the road asking for the jacket before asking whether an 8-year-old child who'd walked out of the desert alone was physically okay. Cole found Grant. 30 minutes, Cole said. We need to use them. For what? Get Ren. I need to see what's actually in that jacket. Grant's eyes changed. You think there's more? She said everything. I believe her. They went to the cooler. Cole knocked twice. Copper. The door opened from inside. Ren stood in a haze of her own breath, the jacket absolutely impeccable, despite everything. Not a patch out of alignment, not a seam stressed. The girl had guarded it the way soldiers guard things they've been told are irreplaceable. Cole knelt in front of her. Ren, I need to see what's inside the jacket. All of it. I think there's more than the note. She looked at him for a moment. The careful measuring look. The inventory. Then she unzipped the jacket. Beneath it, against her skin running in precise rows from her collarbone to her waist, were 17 micro SD cards. Each one the size of a fingernail. Each one adhered to her skin with surgical tape applied in overlapping strips, the kind of application that takes time and care, and the knowledge that the carrier will need to move freely without the cargo shifting. Each card was labeled in handwriting, so small it required close examination to read 2 or 3 characters per label. A personal shorthand that only Nate would have been able to decode fully. Cole stared. The cold air from the open cooler moved around them, and neither of them acknowledged it. He put them on me before the men came, Ren said. Her voice was the same as it had been in the parking lot. Factual. Dry. The voice of someone reporting rather than confessing. He said the jacket was the decoy. He said if they took the jacket, they'd think they had everything. But the real things were on me. What's on these cards? Ren's eyes moved across Cole's face with the slow attention of someone deciding how much weight a surface can bear before trusting it with something heavy. Videos, she said, of the trucks, of the men, of the kids. A pause. My dad filmed everything. For years. At night with a phone he took from one of the guards when they weren't watching. He filmed and he saved and he said someday someone would need to see it. Cole's hands were not steady. He noticed this as a fact and filed it separately from the task the way he'd learned in Fallujah to separate the fact of fear from the management of it. How many children, Ren, did he tell you? He didn't tell me the number. He said a lot. Coming in trucks at night, leaving in different trucks. Always at night. He said he never saw where they went. Cole looked at the cards. 17 of them. Each one the size of a fingernail. Years of documentation stored on surfaces smaller than the tip of his thumb, carried on the body of an 8-year-old girl who had been told to find the riders on the patch if anything happened. He stood up. He turned to Sully, who was standing at the cooler entrance. Copy all of them, Cole said. Every card, 2 backups, one with you, one with Harlan. The originals go back on her. Sully's face did something specific when Cole said the originals go back on her. Not objection. The brief, involuntary contraction of a man who has just absorbed something that has crossed a threshold. Then he opened his laptop. How long, Cole asked. 20 minutes if the cards are formatted the way I think they are. Faster if they're not. You have 18. Sully nodded and began working with the focused efficiency of a man who had spent years in environments where speed and precision were not competing values but the same value expressed differently. Cole stepped back outside. He walked to the edge of the parking lot where he could see the 3 black trucks still sitting on the highway shoulder with their engines running, and he stood there with his hands at his sides and the morning sun pressing down on him like something physical. And he thought about Nate Briggs on a mountain 28 miles north, spending years in the dark filming what he saw on a stolen phone and stitching the evidence into the lining of a jacket and teaching his daughter passwords and map routes and when to run and how to survive alone in July desert for 3 days, and trusting that the man he'd addressed the note to would still be the man he'd known. Cole thought about the birthday card in his wallet. Still here. He turned back to the lot. Grant was already moving through the crowd of brothers, speaking quietly to the men who needed to hear what was coming before the decision was made, not telling them everything, but telling them enough. Cole watched the information move through the crowd, watched the faces change as it reached them, watched the particular stillness that settled over men who had just learned that what they thought they knew was missing its most important piece. He found Grant at the center of the lot. Dunning doesn't get the girl, Cole said. I know. He doesn't get the jacket. I know that too. When Sully finishes copying the cards, the copies go out to 4 chapters before we do anything else. Separate channels, separate riders, 4 different directions, before Dunning comes back. Grant looked at him. And then Cole looked north. The mountains sat on the horizon like they always had, patient and enormous and completely indifferent to what happened at their feet. And then Cole said, I'm going back up there. Grant was quiet for a moment. Wren said Mercer moved Nate after the last snow, Cole said. Took him north up the mountain, not down, which means there's somewhere else up there I didn't see this morning. And Nate is in it. And Dunning showing up here with 3 trucks and a 30-minute deadline means Mercer already knows the girl reached us, and he's trying to recover the evidence before we can act on it. You think he'll move Nate? I think he'll do worse than that, Cole said. If Mercer knows those cards exist and thinks Dunning can get them back, he'll wait. If Dunning comes back in 30 minutes and goes home empty-handed, Mercer will know we have them. And then Nate becomes a liability instead of a hostage. Grant's face was stone, but behind the stone something was giving, not breaking, giving the way a structural element gives when it accepts a load it wasn't originally designed for, but can carry if it commits to it. All right, Grant said. He turned to the lot. He didn't need to raise his voice. The crowd had oriented toward him already, the collective attention of men who had been waiting for someone to tell them what they were waiting for. Mount up, Grant said. Every man. We ride north in 10 minutes. Flagstaff chapter leads. Prescott rides rear guard. The lot moved, not chaotically, with the kind of organized efficiency that comes from years of group rides and the understanding that when the president speaks, you move and ask questions at the next stop. Cole went back to the kitchen. Sully was closing the laptop. He handed Cole 2 drives and confirmed the 4 names receiving copies. Cole nodded. Get those out, Cole said. Now before we move. Sully was already walking. Cole went to the cooler. He knocked. Copper. Wren opened the door. Her breath was visible in small, steady clouds, and her face was composed and watchful, and she was, Cole thought, quite possibly the most self-possessed human being he had ever met at any age. We're going north, he said, to find my dad. Yes. He might not be at the compound anymore. I told you they moved him. I know. We'll find where they took him. Wren considered this with the seriousness she gave to all information. Then she stepped out of the cooler and stood in the warm kitchen air, and the jacket hung to her knees, and the patches sat exactly where they'd been when she walked out of the desert, not a threat out of place. "The password for the next place," she said. "What is it?" Cole looked at her. "Verde," he said. "The name of the river. The thing that had taken Nate and not taken him. The password is Verde." Wren nodded once. The parking lot thundered to life outside. 191 engines staggered, enrolling the sound building into the particular accumulated roar that you felt in your chest before you heard it in your ears. The diner windows vibrated in their frames. Birds scattered from the telephone lines along the highway. Cole helped Wren onto the back of his bike. She was lighter than the jacket she was wearing, and she settled behind him and took hold of his vest with both hands, with the practiced certainty of someone who had done this before or had at least spent a great deal of time thinking about exactly how to do it. "Hold on," Cole said. "Don't let go regardless of what happens." "I won't," she said. He believed her. He dropped his visor. The formation assembled behind Grant's lead bike and the Flagstaff road captains in his. 191 motorcycles in columns that stretched the length of the lot and out onto the highway. Cole was third in line. Wren's hands were locked on the sides of his vest. The formation moved. As they passed the three black trucks on the highway shoulder, Cole turned his head and looked directly at the tinted windshield of the lead vehicle. He couldn't see through the glass, but he felt the eyes behind it, the specific quality of being watched by someone who understood that the situation had just changed in a way that could not be managed from a parked truck on a highway shoulder. He turned his eyes back to the road. North. In his mirror, the three trucks sat motionless for 2 miles. Then they moved. Not south, not in pursuit of the formation. They turned north ahead of the column, taking a parallel county road at a speed that suggested urgency. Cole watched them in his mirror until they disappeared behind a ridgeline. Harlan's voice came from 2 bikes back, carrying in the wind. "They're going to the compound." Cole already knew. Mercer had decided that if he couldn't recover the evidence, he would destroy the crime scene. And every minute the formation spent on the highway was a minute Mercer had to erase the things that Nate Briggs had spent 6 years documenting in the dark. Cole rolled the throttle forward. The formation surged north chrome, catching the morning sun in moving flashes. The sound of the engines rolling across the desert floor like something the landscape was answering. And somewhere ahead, on a mountain that had been keeping its secrets for 8 years, the clock was running down on the space between what had happened there and what anyone would ever be able to prove. They hit the mountain road at full formation. 191 motorcycles climbing in a single column through switchbacks that hadn't been designed for this kind of traffic. The engines echoing off canyon walls and coming back changed, multiplied the sound of one bike becoming the sound of something larger and more fundamental than any single machine. The road narrowed as they climbed, and the trees pressed in from both sides, and the morning light came through the canopy in fragments that moved across the chrome and leather like something alive. Cole rode third in line with Wren pressed against his back, her hands locked onto the sides of his vest with a grip that didn't vary regardless of the terrain. She'd said nothing since they left the diner. She didn't need to. Her hands told him what her voice didn't, the pressure of them communicating something more precise than language. The specific tension of a child riding toward the place she'd spent months running from, and doing it anyway because the alternative was worse than the fear. Behind Cole, 188 men who had come to Drywell to read names from a leather-bound ledger were riding into a mountain that had been hiding something from all of them for 6 years. None of them had been told everything. Grant had told them enough. The girl, the jacket, the compound, Nate Briggs, maybe alive, maybe in prison, definitely not dead in the way they'd been carrying him. A network that had been operating in the silence between jurisdictions while a county sheriff owned the land, and the system that should have been looking the other way, deliberately looked the other way. The reaction had not been noise. It had been silence, and then the engines, and then this. At the 4-mile mark, Harlan pulled alongside Cole and pointed. Tire tracks on the logging road, fresh, heavy vehicles, the dirt still damp in the shadows where the morning sun hadn't reached yet. Dunning's trucks had come this way less than an hour ago. Cole pushed the throttle forward. The formation surged. Bikes that had been climbing carefully began climbing fast, the caution giving way to something more urgent. The understanding that the gap between the 3 black trucks and 191 motorcycles was closing, but not closed, and that every minute it wasn't closed was a minute Mercer had to do what men in his position did when the walls started moving inward. At mile 5, Harlan raised his fist. The formation slowed. Cole killed his engine and the silence spread backward through the column, bike by bike, until the mountain returned to itself. Smoke. Not wood smoke. Not the clean smell of a campfire or brush burning in controlled conditions. Something sharper, chemical, the smell of burning plastic and treated lumber and paper and whatever else you feed a fire when the specific goal is destruction rather than heat. They're burning it, Cole thought. The records, the communications, everything that could be read by someone who knew what they were reading. He dropped his visor and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. He rolled the throttle and the column moved and the mountain shook with the sound of engines that had stopped being patient. They came out of the tree line and into the clearing at speed. The compound was burning on its northern edge. Not all of it. The main buildings were intact, their windows dark, their doors open. But the structures on the north side, the storage sheds, what looked like a communications room, a smaller building whose function Cole hadn't been able to identify from the ridge that morning, were fully involved. Orange flames climbed 40 feet into the morning air, and black smoke rolled across the clearing in sheets that stung the eyes and coated the throat, and turned the sunlight the particular dirty amber of a sky that has absorbed something it shouldn't have to hold. Men ran between the buildings, not soldiers, not a coordinated defense. Men in a panic carrying boxes and laptops and armfuls of paper, throwing them into truck beds, throwing them into the fire, making the decisions that people make when they've run out of time. And the only remaining variable is what gets saved and what gets left. In the center of the compound, standing beside Dunning's lead F-350, with a radio in one hand and his eyes already on the tree line where the formation was emerging, stood a man Cole hadn't seen before. Mid-60s, thin in the way of a man who moved constantly and ate only when he remembered to. Canvas jacket work boots, the weathered face of someone who had spent decades building things in places nobody was watching. He held the radio with the practiced ease of long use, and his eyes moved across the incoming formation with the calculation of someone counting and finding the count unfavorable and adjusting his plan accordingly. Douglas Mercer. Grant rode through the compound gate. He didn't stop at the gate because the gate was open. The chain link swung back on both sides. The razor wire pulled clear. The entrance prepared for the trucks that were supposed to carry everything away before anyone arrived. He stopped his bike 20 feet from Mercer and killed the engine. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then 190 motorcycles rolled in behind him, filling the clearing, blocking the road, spreading across every open space in the compound with the organized instinct of men who had been riding in formation long enough to understand without being told how to seal a space. Chrome caught the morning sun and threw it in every direction. The sound of engines dying in sequence moved across the compound like a wave that left stillness in its wake. Mercer looked at the bikes. He looked at the men. He looked at the smoke rising from his burning evidence, and at the sheriff's trucks sitting useless against the eastern fence, and at the face of the man who had just parked 20 feet away from him and was getting off his bike with the unhurried ease of someone who had already decided how this ended. Grant walked forward until he stood 10 feet from Mercer. His massive frame was backlit by the morning sun and the orange glow of the fire still eating through the northern structures. He looked at Mercer the way a man looks at something he's been carrying for a long time and has finally put down in the right place. "You're done," Grant said. "I'm leaving," Mercer said. His voice was steady. The voice of a man who had built an operation over a decade by keeping his voice steady in rooms where other men's voices shook. "Your compound is seized. Dunning is in custody. We have everything Nate Briggs recorded, every card, every file, every minute of footage. 17 SD cards worth of documentation delivered to 3 federal agencies before you decided to start that fire." Grant nodded toward the burning buildings. "Whatever you're burning right now is already redundant." Something moved behind Mercer's eyes. Not fear, a recalculation. The specific adjustment of a man who has just learned that a variable he thought he controlled was already out of his hands, who is now running a new calculation with updated inputs and doesn't like where it's coming out. The passenger door of one of the compound trucks opened. Wade Strick stepped out. 6'2", bearded, a neck tattoo that ran from his jaw to his collar, carrying a rifle with the practiced ease of someone who had carried one professionally before whatever had ended that career. He moved to Mercer's left side and raised the rifle to his shoulder with the efficiency of a man for whom the motion was rehearsed, the barrel tracking across the formation with a steadiness that said he was looking for a specific target, not making a general threat. Cole was already moving. He didn't think about it in the way that decisions are usually thought about. He moved from the place where the last 7 years of carrying Nate's absence and the last 24 hours of understanding what that absence had actually cost had resolved themselves into something that was past anger and past grief and past calculation. He was off his bike and crossing the clearing, and Wren's hands were no longer on his back because she was still on the bike, and he had open ground between himself and Strick, and he covered it with the specific economy of a man who has learned that the first move in a violent situation is the one that matters most. Boone was faster. 280 pounds, covered 20 feet in 3 strides with a speed that violated everything the size suggested was possible. Boone hit Strick at the waist with the full momentum of his frame, and the rifle discharged into the air with a crack that split the morning open and sent birds from every tree in the surrounding forest into the sky at once. The sound bounced off the canyon walls and came back again, fading slowly, the way a question fades when no one answers it. Strick was face down in the dirt with Boone's knee between his shoulder blades before the echo finished. The rifle was 6 feet away. Strick's hands were empty and his face was pressed into the compound's gravel, and he was making no attempt to change either of those things, which was the correct decision. Mercer didn't run. He stood beside his truck and watched his organization end with the same expression he'd worn when Cole first saw him in the clearing, measured, controlled, the face of a man who had spent so long operating in the gap between what was legal and what was visible that he had forgotten there was a version of the world in which the gap closed. Cole stopped 3 feet from him. He looked at this man, at the canvas jacket and the work boots, and the weathered face and the radio still in his hand, at the eyes that were running their calculation and not finding a result that helped. "The children," Cole said. Mercer looked at him. "The ones who came through this compound. Where did they go?" Not a question. A demand delivered in the register Cole used for things that were not negotiable. Mercer said nothing. "You have about 60 seconds, Cole said, before the men standing behind me decide that your cooperation is no longer the most important variable in this situation. I'd use them." Mercer's jaw tightened. His eyes moved across the formation behind Cole, across the 191 men who were standing in his compound with the specific stillness of people who have been told to wait and are waiting, but for whom waiting has a time limit. And he made the calculation that a man of his type always eventually makes when the arithmetic finally runs out. "Talk to my attorney," he said. Cole stepped back. He turned to the compound. "The building," he said to Harlan, "the half-buried one." Harlan was already moving. The door was steel and padlocked with a commercial-grade lock. Sully had bolt cutters from a toolbox on one of the abandoned compound trucks. He cut the lock with a single application of force that left a mark in his forearm muscles that would be visible for a week. The door swung open. Stairs, concrete, going down into darkness that smelled like damp earth and fear, and the specific combination of inadequate ventilation and human occupation that a place acquires when people have been kept in it for long enough that the walls have absorbed what happened to them. Cole went down first. The flashlight beam moved across cinder block walls, damp with condensation. A corridor 6 feet wide, doors on both sides, all closed, all padlocked. The silence down here was different from the silence above. Thicker, more deliberate. The silence of a space that had been built to contain sound rather than simply absent of it. Cole moved to the first door on the left. Sully cut the lock. Cole opened it. A room 10 feet by 12. A mattress on the floor with a blanket folded on it, with the precision of someone who had been told to keep their space orderly and had done so because compliance was safer than the alternative. A bucket in the corner. No window. No working light fixture, just the battery-powered emergency light above the door, throwing pale yellow across everything. On the mattress pressed against the far wall with their knees drawn up and their eyes wide against the flashlight beam, two children. A boy and a girl, maybe 10 and 12 years old, thin in the way that isn't natural at those ages. Their faces showing the careful blankness of children who had learned that showing too much of what they felt was not safe. Decker pushed past Cole and knelt beside them. His hands were steady, not the steadiness of someone who wasn't feeling anything, but the specific steadiness of a man who had been trained to function precisely when everything inside him was doing the opposite of functioning. He spoke to them in a voice so stripped of anything alarming that it didn't sound like it could come from a man wearing a skull patch on his vest. "You're safe," Decker said. "Nobody here is going to hurt you. We're going to get you out of here right now." Cole moved to the next door. Lock cut, door open. Three children younger huddled together on a single mattress with the animal instinct of creatures conserving warmth in proximity when both were insufficient. They blinked against the flashlight. One of them, a boy who couldn't have been older than 7, raised his arm against the light in the automatic gesture of someone who has been in darkness long enough that sudden brightness is painful. Decker came through behind Cole. Two brothers from the formation had come down the stairs and were helping. Cole kept moving. The next door. Two more children. Then an empty room with a mattress that showed the impression of a body in the foam, and on the cinder block wall beside the mattress, scratched into the surface with something small and sharp tally marks. Groups of 5. Cole counted them in the flashlight beam without stopping moving and reached 43 before he passed the doorway and let the number settle into the part of him where the things that couldn't be fixed lived alongside the things that had to be carried. Someone had been counting days. He reached the last door on the right. The lock on this one was different. Heavier. Newer. A chain wrapped through the door handle and secured with a padlock that was a grade above anything else in the corridor, the kind of upgrade that communicated something about the status of whatever was being contained behind it. Sully looked at the chain. He looked at Cole. Cole nodded. Sully cut it on the third attempt. The chain fell against the concrete floor with a sound that was too loud for the space and too loud for what Cole was feeling, and both of those things at once. The door opened inward. The room was smaller than the others. 8 feet by 10. No mattress. No bucket in the corner. Just concrete floor, concrete walls, a steel pipe running along the ceiling at head height, and attached to that pipe by a set of handcuffs that had been in place long enough to have worn through the skin of both wrists in overlapping cycles of damage. A man sitting slumped against the wall beneath the pipe with his chin on his chest and his breathing so shallow that Cole stood in the doorway for 2 full seconds, trying to determine if he was looking at someone alive. The man was thin in the way that goes past thin into something that has its own word. The specific reduction that happens when a body has been given just enough to stay functioning and no margin beyond that for years at a time. His clothes were the wrong size, too large now for the frame they covered. His hair had gone completely gray. His wrists showed the particular damage of prolonged restraint, the layered scarring of skin that has been broken and healed and broken again until healing is just the preparation for the next break. His face was bruised. Old bruises laid over older bruises in the way a place looks when damage has been applied at regular intervals over a long period of time. But his hands, Cole recognized his hands. Long fingers scarred at the knuckles in the specific way of a man who had spent years doing precise mechanical work in tight spaces. The hands of a machinist. The hands that had built a custom skull zipper pull in a garage in Prescott and held it up in firelight and said it was the only piece of hardware he completely trusted. The hands that had sewn a message into the lining of a jacket and taped 17 cards to a child's body and told her she had done good. "Nate," Cole said. The man didn't move. "Nate." Cole crossed the room in 3 steps and knelt on the concrete floor and put his hand on Nate's shoulder gently, the way you touch something that might be closer to the edge than it looks. The contact traveled through Nate's body like a current. His head came up. The muscles in his neck worked against gravity with the effort of a man lifting something heavier than it should be, the weight of a head after months of having insufficient reason to raise it. His eyes opened. They were brown. They were the same brown they had always been, the particular shade that Cole had looked across campfires at and ridden beside on highways and stood next to at the Verde River with a flashlight trying to find what the water was supposed to have taken. They were the eyes of a man who had been at the bottom of a very specific kind of darkness and had stayed there not because he couldn't imagine anything else, but because he had decided that staying was necessary and had held to that decision for 6 years in a room with no windows. They were different too, deeper. The difference between the eyes of a man who has seen difficult things and the eyes of a man who has seen them and stayed present for all of them and carried the weight of witnessing when leaving wasn't an option. Cole, Nate said. His voice was a rasp. The sound of vocal cords that hadn't been used for speaking in weeks, abraded and rough, carrying the word across the distance between them with an effort that was audible. Yeah, Cole said. It's me. A silence, then Ren. She's here. She's safe. She found us. Nate's face did something that Cole would carry for the rest of his life. Not a breakdown in the theatrical sense. A release. Everything that had been held together by necessity and will, and the decision to stay functional because the children in the other rooms needed someone to know what was happening to them. All of it let go at once in the specific way that only happens when the thing a person has been holding themselves together for is finally undeniably present. The sound he made had no words in it. Cole held him. On a concrete floor in a room that smelled like 6 years of controlled suffering, Cole held this man who weighed nothing and had given everything and said nothing because there was nothing that would fit inside the moment without diminishing it. Get these off him, Cole said when he could speak again. Sully worked the bolt cutters on the handcuffs. The first one parted with a sound like a bone finding its limit. Nate's right arm dropped to his side with the weight of something that had forgotten it was supposed to move freely. The second cuff. Sully cut. Nate fell forward into Cole's arms, and Cole caught him and held his weight, and it was nothing, it was almost nothing. And that absence of weight was the most devastating thing Cole had felt since the night he'd stood on the bank of the Verde River and understood for the first time that he might have to accept something he didn't believe. Decker was there moving around Cole with practiced efficiency, his hands doing the rapid assessment of a man reading a body for its most urgent needs. Broken ribs 3 at minimum. Severe dehydration, malnourishment chronic. The wrist would need significant treatment. The bruising suggested repeated blunt trauma over an extended period. The lung function was compromised. We need to get him to a hospital, Decker said. Not county, something federal adjacent. Not county, Nate said immediately. His grip on Cole's arm was stronger than his condition had any right to produce. Dunning. Dunning owns the county medical infrastructure the same way he owns everything else. We know about Dunning, Cole said. He's in cuffs. Nate's eyes sharpened. It's not just Dunning. His voice was urgent beneath the damage. There's a judge. Reeves Alton Reeves Family Court. He processes the children into the system through fake foster placements, signs paperwork that makes them disappear legally, and a contractor man named Cole Garrett Cole. He builds the holding sites. There are 3 more compounds, Cole, not just this one. Cole went still. Northern Arizona, southern Utah, western New Mexico. Same setup, same network. Mercer runs the operations. Reeves provides the legal cover. Cole builds the infrastructure. Nate's hand tightened on Cole's arm. They've been doing this for 10 years. This compound is one piece. Cole looked at Sully. Sully had the notebook out, the one he kept in his vest pocket next to the sobriety chip, writing fast in the small, precise handwriting of a man who had learned that information only stays reliable if you write it down while you still have it. How many children total? Cole asked. Through this compound alone, 94 in 6 years. The other 3 locations I don't know. I heard numbers sometimes, but I don't know how accurate they were. Nate paused. The pause had the weight of a man setting something down carefully. I tried to get every face on the cards, every truck, every date I could determine. I don't know if it's enough. It's enough, Cole said. The copies went out before we rode up here. 3 federal agencies have them already. Nate closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were wet, but his jaw was set. Ren, he said again. Right here, Dad. Cole turned. Ren stood at the door of the room. She had come down the stairs despite being told to stay at the top, which was entirely consistent with everything Cole had learned about her in the last 24 hours. She stood in the doorway in her father's jacket with her hands at her sides and her face showing the first thing Cole had seen on it. That wasn't the careful management of a child who had learned to keep her reactions contained. She was crying without sound. The tears ran down her face and dropped from her chin onto the leather jacket, and she didn't wipe them, and she didn't look away. Nate raised one arm toward her. The arm shook with the effort. She crossed the room in 2 steps and hit his chest, and his arms closed around her. Both of them now wrapped around his daughter with a completeness that accounted for the time they'd been building toward this, and the time they'd been separated, and the choice Nate had made to stay in this room instead of leaving, because leaving meant the evidence walked out with him and the children kept coming. Cole stood up. His knees ached. His eyes burned. He walked out of the room and up the stairs and into the daylight and the smoke and the compound full of men who had seized a mountain with noise and numbers and the refusal to look the other way. Grant met him at the top of the stairs. Nate, Grant said, not a question. Alive. Decker's with him. 3 cracked ribs, severe malnourishment, wrist damage from long-term restraint. Cole paused. And 3 more compounds. Grant, Arizona, Utah, New Mexico. Same network. A judge named Reeves and a contractor named Cull. This is one piece of something bigger. Grant's hands closed into fists at his sides and opened again. He turned away, took 4 steps, stood with his back to Cole and his head down. His shoulders moved once. Then he turned back and his face was iron over whatever was happening underneath it. The copies went out, Grant asked. Before we rode, Sully confirmed delivery to 3 field offices. Then they can't put it back. Grant looked at the compound at the burning buildings and the men sitting against the fence with their hands empty and the sheriff's trucks going nowhere. How long until federal response? We called from the road. FBI said 90 minutes from the time we called. That was 40 minutes ago. Grant nodded. He turned to the compound. Mercer was seated on the ground beside his truck, his hands zip-tied behind him with ties borrowed from the compound's own supply, which had struck Cole as appropriate. He was looking at nothing specific, the gaze of a man running internal calculations that kept reaching the same answer and finding it unacceptable. Wade Strick was face down in the gravel 15 feet away, Boone standing over him with the particular stillness of a man who had made a decision about how much movement he was going to allow and had communicated that decision non-verbally. The other compound personnel, 12 men, had been disarmed and seated against the eastern fence by brothers who had served in enough situations to know how to move people efficiently from a threat state to a contained state without requiring anyone to say anything dramatic about it. Cole walked to Mercer. He stood over him for a moment. Mercer looked up. Their eyes met and held. The children, Cole said. The ones who were already moved out of this compound. Where did they go? Mercer said nothing. The other compounds, Cole said. I have the locations from Nate. I have the documentation. The federal warrants are already being written. He crouched down so his eyes were level with Mercer's. I'm not asking you to save yourself. It's too late for that, and you know it. I'm asking you where the children are. Something moved across Mercer's face. Not conscience, something more practical. The calculation of a man who understands that some currencies retain value even after everything else has been spent. Reeves has a transport schedule, Mercer said. His voice was flat and stripped of everything except the fact of the information. He maintains it on a server I don't have access to, but the next transfer is Friday. Western New Mexico site. There's a county road that runs north from the interstate junction, mile marker 62. Cole stood up. He walked to Grant and repeated the information. Grant was on the phone before Cole finished the second sentence using the number the FBI agent had given them, speaking in the flat, precise language of a man transmitting coordinates he's been told are time-sensitive. The next 2 hours moved with the grinding efficiency of institutional machinery engaging. Federal agents landed in the clearing in helicopters that descended through the compound smoke, with their spotlights carving the area into high-contrast sections of white and shadow. The first team secured Mercer and Strick and the seated compound personnel with the practiced speed of people who had been briefed on what they were landing into. The second team went to the underground corridor and came back up with the 7 children, Decker still with them, his hands still moving, still speaking in that stripped-down voice that didn't alarm. Nate was brought up last. Cole and Sully carried him between them, his arms over their shoulders, his feet moving but not bearing weight. He came into the daylight and stopped. He stood there in the July morning in a compound that had held him for 6 years and looked at the sky and the trees and the chrome of 191 motorcycles filling the clearing and didn't speak. Then he looked at the men. Not at any one of them. At all of them. At the leather and the patches and the faces that had come up a mountain because a little girl walked into a parking lot and a note said, "Don't come alone." "I didn't think there'd be this many," he said finally. "This is what you've got," Grant said. His voice was rough. "Every one of them." Nate looked at Grant. They had known each other for 20 years, since before either of them understood what 20 years of anything felt like, and the look between them contained most of that. Grant put his hand on Nate's shoulder, and neither of them said anything, because the things that needed to be said between them were going to require more time and more space than a burning compound on a July morning could provide. At 4 in the afternoon, the radio they'd taken from one of the compound trucks crackled. Sully was monitoring it. He held up a hand for quiet and pressed it to his ear, and his face went through 3 distinct changes in the space of 4 seconds. He brought it to Cole. A voice unhurried and controlled. The voice of a man who had built an empire on patience and was now employing that same quality in its dismantling. "Mercer, this is Voss. Secondary designation. If Mingus is compromised, initiate bridge protocol. Mile marker 9. Close the mountain." Cole looked at Sully. "Voss," Sully said. "There's someone above Mercer." Cole hadn't known that. Nate hadn't mentioned it. Either Nate hadn't known or he'd been unconscious when the call came through, and it was meant for people other than him. "Bridge protocol," Harlan said from behind them. His voice had the quality of a man translating something from a language he knows well. "Mile marker 9 is the wooden bridge on the South Road, the only vehicle access down the mountain." Cole was already moving. "Grant," he said. Grant heard the tone. "What?" "Someone's going to burn the bridge. If the bridge goes, FBI ground units can't reach the mountain. We're trapped up here until they engineer another crossing, and the network has time to scatter." Grant's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. "How long do we have?" "Harlan," Cole said. "If they've already started, 20 minutes. Maybe less." Cole looked at the formation, at the 191 bikes filling the compound clearing, at the men. "Grant stays here with Nate and Decker and the children," Cole said. "4 brothers stay with them. The rest ride south now fast. We get below that bridge before it's gone." "And if we don't make it," someone asked from behind him, "then we're on the mountain until the FBI engineers a crossing, and the network has 12 hours to scatter." Cole pulled his helmet on. "We make it." He kicked his bike to life. 186 motorcycles followed. They came down the mountain the way they'd gone up, but faster, the formation pushing through the switchbacks with the controlled urgency of riders who understood that the terrain was a constraint to be managed rather than an obstacle to stop them. The smoke from the compound fell behind. The road opened and narrowed and opened again. The engine sound bounced off the canyon walls and filled the mountain with a noise that was past mechanical and into something older. At mile marker 11, Cole smelled smoke from a different direction. Below them, from the south. The smell of burning creosote timber, the specific signature of old bridgewood that has been treated against rot and moisture over decades, and is now burning with the particular intensity of something that was built to last. Cole rolled the throttle to its limit. The formation hit mile marker 9 at the edge of the possible. The bridge was burning at its southern anchor, the old timber stringers catching from the accelerant that had been poured along their length. The flames not yet reached the road's surface, but moving toward it with the patient inevitability of fire that has been given adequate fuel and time. Standing on the northern bank between the formation and the burning bridge were two vehicles. A truck Cole didn't recognize and one of the compound's F-350s. And beside them, four men, two of whom were holding rifles, and two of whom were holding fuel cans that explained the smell. Cole stopped the formation 50 yards back. He got off the bike. He left the bike and walked forward alone, the way he'd walked toward Dunning's truck on the highway shoulder outside Drywell, with his hands visible and his steps deliberate, and the specific quality of purpose that communicated itself to anyone with enough experience to read it. "That's far enough," one of the riflemen said. Cole stopped at 30 feet. He looked past the rifleman at the truck, at the man standing beside it who hadn't moved since the formation appeared at the top of the road. Older than Mercer, heavier, the face of someone who had operated behind layers of other people's names and organizations for so long that the face itself had become a kind of anonymity. He held nothing in his hands, and his expression was completely still, and Cole understood, looking at him, that this was the architecture of the entire operation, the person that Mercer reported to, the person that Dunning had been protecting by protecting Mercer. "You're Voss," Cole said. The man said nothing. "The evidence is already at 3 federal field offices," Cole said. "Mercer is in federal custody on the mountain. Dunning is in custody. Your bridge won't help you. The only road north is behind me." Voss looked at the formation behind Cole, at the wall of bikes stretched across the road. "You're civilians," Voss said. His voice was exactly what Cole had expected. Precise controlled the voice of a man who had spent decades making decisions that ended other people's options. "You have no authority here." "You're right," Cole said. "We don't have authority. We have 186 people standing between you and that interstate, and we don't need authority for that." Voss looked at the riflemen. One of them raised his weapon. Cole watched it happen the way he'd watched things happen in Fallujah, with the slow, hyper-detailed perception that activates when the body understands that the next second matters more than any second before it. The rifle came up. The barrel tracked toward Cole's center mass. Boone moved. From the left flank of the formation where he'd positioned himself without Cole noticing or instructing, Boone covered the distance between the formation and the rifleman in the time it took the rifleman's finger to find the trigger guard. Boone hit him from the side with the full force of his 280 pounds in motion, and the rifle discharged into the roadbed with a sound like the mountain clearing its throat. The rifleman went down and stayed down, and Boone stood over him with the specific stillness of a man who has made a decision and is communicating its finality without additional words. The second rifleman looked at this. He set his weapon on the ground and stepped back from it with his hands at shoulder height. The two men with fuel cans put the fuel cans down. Voss stood beside his truck and watched the architecture of his operation collapse in the specific way that things collapse when the foundation is removed completely and without recovery. From the south, from beyond the burning bridge, from the direction of the highway, in the world that existed below this mountain came the sound of helicopter rotors. More than one, growing louder. FBI, coming fast following the route that ground units couldn't take because the bridge was burning. The helicopters crested the ridge to the south, and their spotlights found the road and found the trucks, and found Voss and found Cole in the formation, and held on all of it simultaneously. A voice from the nearest helicopter's PA system, enormous and distorted and entirely clear. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Do not move. Keep your hands visible. This is a federal operation. Do not move." Voss looked at the helicopters. He looked at Cole. Cole looked back at him and said nothing because there was nothing left that needed saying. The man who had built a network that had moved children and trucks through the dark for 10 years was standing on a mountain road with his hands beginning to rise and nowhere to go in any direction. The agents landed. What followed had the grinding, impersonal efficiency of federal machinery operating at full engagement. Voss was secured, his men were secured, the riflemen, the fuel carriers, the driver of the second truck, who had been sitting in the cab since the formation arrived and making no attempt to change that. All of it documented processed the weight of the institutional response settling over the mountain like a different kind of gravity. Cole stood at the edge of the road and watched. At 9 in the evening, the bridge situation was resolved with a portable span that the federal engineers had airlifted in components. By 10, ground vehicles were moving again. By midnight, the three other compounds had been simultaneously raided by coordinated teams from FBI, U.S. Marshals, and Homeland Security. Cole heard this from a federal agent who told him because the evidence that had made the raids possible had come from his people, and she thought he should know the result. 23 more children, 41 arrests, Judge Alton Reeves taken into custody at his home. Garrett Cull arrested at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport with a boarding pass to a city whose name Cole didn't ask and didn't need. The mountain was done with its secrets. Nate was airlifted to a hospital in Phoenix Federal Protective Custody, no county involvement of any kind. Decker rode in the helicopter with him because Cole had asked and the lead agent had agreed. Wren rode with Nate. She sat beside the gurney and held her father's hand with both of hers and watched his face and didn't look at anything else. Cole watched the helicopter lift from the compound clearing. He watched it rise through the smoke from the dying fires and bank south and diminish against the sky until it was a sound, and then until it was nothing. He stood in the compound that had held Nate for 6 years and breathed the air of a place that was done being what it had been. 3 months later, the parking lot of Cassidy's Diner in Drywell, Arizona, was full again. October this time. The heat had broken the way a fever breaks suddenly and completely, leaving behind an air clarity that made the mountains look close enough to touch the sky above them, a shade of blue that only existed at altitude in the fall, too saturated to be real, except that it was. The parking lot held 191 motorcycles in the October sunlight chrome, catching a light that was angled now softer. The particular quality of autumn sun in the high desert that made everything look like a photograph of itself. Cole sat on the same concrete barrier where he'd sat in July with cold coffee and the same feeling of watching things he didn't yet understand. The coffee was hot this time. He held it in both hands and let the warmth move into his palms and watched the lot fill with the sound of men who had come back to the place where something had changed and wanted to stand in it again. The federal investigation had consumed the intervening months. Statements, depositions, meetings with prosecutors who had needed the club's cooperation and had not always known how to ask for it in ways that acknowledged what the club had done. Grant had handled most of it with the organizational patience that had always been his particular gift. Cole had handled the parts that required someone who could sit in a room with a federal attorney and answer questions about the interior of a mountain compound without his voice changing. The case against Voss, Mercer, Dunning, Reeves, and Cull was, according to the prosecutor who had called Cole 2 weeks ago, one of the most comprehensively documented trafficking operations ever brought to federal court. 17 SD cards, 6 years of footage, 94 documented children at the Mingus site alone, 41 arrests across 4 states. A network that had operated in the silence between jurisdictions for a decade had been taken apart in a single morning because an 8-year-old girl had memorized a map and eaten it. A van pulled into the lot at 11 o'clock. Blue scratched the kind of vehicle that had been purchased, used, and driven without excessive concern for its appearance. It parked at the edge of the lot and the passenger door opened. Nate Briggs stepped out. He was thin still. 3 months of hospital food and Wren's relentless supervision of his plate had restored him towards something approaching his former weight, but the process was incomplete and would be for a while yet. He wore jeans and boots and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and the scars on his wrists where the handcuffs had lived for months had faded from red to pink and would eventually fade to white and would never fully disappear. He stood in the parking lot and looked at the bikes, at the men, at the leather and the patches and the chrome and the faces of brothers he hadn't seen in 6 years. Brothers who had read his name from a ledger and carried him and then ridden into the mountains when his daughter told them he was still breathing. Nobody rushed him. Nobody called his name or ran across the lot or did any of the things that reunions do in movies. They stood there and looked at him and let the moment exist on its own terms because some returns don't need enhancement. They need witness. Then the van's side door opened and Wren came around it. She was wearing something new. A vest cut and sewn by the Flagstaff chapter's road captain from pieces of Nate's original jacket, the leather carefully worked, and the patches transferred with the precision of someone who understood that the original placement mattered. The steel Saint Center rocker, the chapter designation, the name tab stitched in white on black Briggs, not Nate, because the vest belonged to both of them now. The vest fit her perfectly, which meant someone had measured her without her noticing, which meant the people who made it had been paying attention in the quiet way that people pay attention when they want to get something exactly right. Wren walked across the parking lot with the vest on her shoulders and her chin at the angle Cole had come to recognize as her default, the angle of a child who had decided a long time ago that looking down was not a useful habit. She walked past the rows of bikes and the men standing between them, and she stopped in front of Cole. She looked at him. He knelt down. The asphalt was cool now. October rather than July, and his knees registered the difference the way they registered all differences in temperature, which was to say they registered it clearly, and he ignored it. "Thank you," Wren said. Cole looked at her. "You did the hard part," he said. 28 miles, 3 days, no shoes. You did that. "But you believe me," she said. Cole held her gaze. Behind those brown eyes that had always been too old for the face they lived in, something was different from July. Not less serious. Serious in a different direction. The seriousness of a child who has been through something enormous and is beginning slowly to understand that the enormous thing is behind her rather than ahead. "Your dad made it easy to believe," Cole said. She shook her head. "He told me to find the riders. He said they'd know what to do." She paused. "But he didn't know for sure. He was guessing. He was hoping." She looked at Cole steadily. "You're the one who actually believed me. That's different." Cole had no answer for that. That was better than the truth, so he stayed quiet and let the truth stand without decoration. Nate appeared beside Wren. He put his hand on her shoulder gently, the way you touch something you've been afraid you wouldn't get to touch again and now can't stop needing to confirm is real. Cole stood. He looked at Nate. Nate looked back at him. 20 years of knowing each other looked back at Cole through eyes that had seen the bottom of a specific darkness and had chosen daily to keep looking up from it. "You look terrible," Nate said. "You were chained to a pipe for 6 months," Cole said. "I think I'm winning." Nate's face did something that was almost a smile. The way a man's face does something almost a smile when the feeling behind it is too large for the expression to contain fully. Grant appeared with the ledger, the leather-bound book that had been in the club for 30 years, that had held the names of the men who didn't come home that Cole had read from in July, standing in this parking lot with Nate's name in it, like a stone he'd been moving around for 6 years. Grant opened it to Nate's page. He uncapped a pen. He drew a single line through the entry, deliberate and unhurried, not erasing it, not removing it from the record, but marking it the way you mark something that was written in error without pretending the error didn't happen. A correction that acknowledges its own history. Beneath the line, he wrote one word: returned. He held the book up so the men in the lot could see it. The sound that came from 191 men was not a cheer. It was lower than that. It came from the chest rather than the throat. The sound of men who have been through something they don't have adequate language for and are using the only other register available to them. The sound of engines nearly. The sound of something that runs deep and continuous and doesn't require explanation to be understood by anyone who is built for it. Cole sat back down on the concrete barrier. He held his coffee in both hands and watched the parking lot and the men and the mountains on the horizon, brown and clear and close in the October light. Nate sat beside him. They didn't speak for a while. The lot moved around them, the sounds of men who had come back to a place that meant something, and we're allowing it to mean something without being required to articulate what. The new waitress brought coffee without being asked. The mountains sat on the horizon the way they always had, patient and enormous and indifferent to what happened at their feet. 3 months, Nate said eventually. Yeah. Ren starts school next month. 3rd grade. She's terrified. Of school. Of kids her own age. She's never been around them. Not normal ones. He paused. She figured out how to survive on a mountain alone for 3 days. I think regular 3rd grade is going to be fine. I think so too. A silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that develops between people who have said the important things and are now just present with each other in the way that presence without agenda or performance is its own form of communication. I need to tell you something, Nate said. Cole waited. There were nights down there when I wanted to stop. Not escape. Stop. Just let the whole thing go. The evidence, the documentation, the reason I was staying. He looked at his hands at the fading scars. The only thing that kept me moving was knowing Ren was upstairs and that she needed me to still be there in the morning. He paused. And on the worst nights when I couldn't hear her footsteps, when they'd moved her somewhere I couldn't track. I thought about you walking the riverbank with a flashlight. The county sent word to Mercer about it. Mercer told me, trying to show me nobody was coming. But it showed me something different. It showed me that you were still looking. That somewhere out there, one person hadn't accepted the story they were given. He looked at Cole. I told myself that if you'd look that hard for a dead man, you'd look harder for a living one. If I could just get a reason to you. If I could just get the jacket out. Cole held his coffee. The October sun was warm on his face, and the desert spread out in every direction around the diner, and the mountains on the horizon were the same mountains they'd always been. And the morning was quiet in the specific way that mornings after things that mattered are quiet, when the noise has settled and what's left is just the fact of it. I stopped, Cole said. 3 weeks and I stopped. You started again, Nate said. Cole thought about a parking lot in July, a girl walking out of the heat shimmer, a jacket with a note in the collar and 17 cards on her skin and 28 miles of desert behind her. He thought about a birthday card in his wallet, 2 words written in handwriting he'd been able to identify on a folded square of paper at 10 feet. Still here. He thought about what it meant that those words had been true the whole time, even when he'd believed they weren't, even when he'd let himself be told they weren't, even when he'd stopped looking. Yeah, Cole said. I did. The engines were starting up around the lot. Brothers heading home, heading back to chapters and families, and the regular roads of their regular lives, which were different now in ways that wouldn't be visible from the outside, but would be felt for a long time from the inside. The sound built slowly, engine by engine, filling the October morning with the accumulated rumble of machines that had been somewhere worth going and were now beginning to make their way back. Cole didn't move yet. He sat with Nate on the concrete barrier and drank his coffee and let the sound build around him, and felt for the first time since a November 6 years ago, when the world had given him a lie, he'd eventually stopped arguing with the particular quality of having done the thing that needed doing. Not the mountain, not the compound, not Voss or Dunning or the federal helicopters or the coordinated raids or any of the operational machinery of what had happened. The thing he meant was smaller than all of that and more important than all of it. He'd believed a girl who walked out of the desert. He'd read the note and felt the handwriting and trusted what he recognized and acted on it, when the easier and safer and more socially acceptable thing would have been to hand an 8-year-old child to the first badge that appeared on the highway and let the system decide what she was worth. He'd believed her, and she had been right. And across from him in a diner in a town the world had no particular reason to remember, a father watched his daughter eat breakfast, and the daughter ate with the focused attention of someone who had decided that food was going to be reliable from now on, and was settling into that reliability with her whole self. And the desert breathed around them in the morning, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, and the engines of 191 motorcycles carried their riders back to the roads that waited for them, steady and low and honest, in the way that some things are honest when they've been through enough to have earned it. Cole finished his coffee. He put the cup down on the concrete barrier where it had been sitting in July, when everything was still just the ordinary weight of an ordinary morning. He looked north one more time. The mountain sat there in the October light, clear and close, and completely without mystery. He looked away. That was enough.